Hello and welcome back to Biber Hunter's game models and a slightly different kind of figure painting video. What's different this time? Well, I will tell you after the intro. So, one difference compared to my other figure painting videos is that this figure is in 1/16 scale. And the other one is, you may guessed it already, it has a working LED. So, this is my first ever model where I can plug an USB cable to and something happens. If you came for the figure painting, you may skip the building and wiring and jump right to the painting part. But if you are interested in the complete story, please feel free to get comfortable and enjoy the video. This is the figure I will use in this video, a 3D printed pilot from the Afrika Korps. A friend of mine helped me with his designing skills by cutting the figure in 4 pieces and adding tunnels for the LED wires, which I had to guide through the whole figure. Of course, this made it way more easy for me compared to drilling or milling grooves through a one-piece figure. I built a simple hollow base from styrofoam where I can guide the wire through and install an USB socket for the power supply. With pins in the feet and torso, I wanted to achieve a stronger hold between the parts and the base and tested the fit. But before gluing everything together, I checked if the LED is actually working. With this out of the way, I could start guiding the LED and wires through the single pieces. I had to be very careful here because the wires are super thin and fragile. So, of course, I checked again if the LED is still working afterwards. Better safe than sorry and ending up with a not working LED after gluing and painting. With being sure the LED is still working, I used my favorite super glue to glue the parts together, the point of no return, so to say. Again, I made sure to not damage the wires and that they hold their position and aren't sliding out. The activator spray helped me to instantly dry the glue, so nothing is moving anymore. I glued a piece of copper wire into the flare pistol barrel and fixed the wire and LED around it, so the LED or flare can hold its position supported by the copper wire, not bending downwards. When the glue dried out, I used Bergswerk debonder to remove excess glue, so I ended up with a smooth result. Now I had to fill the remaining gaps with 2-part putty, and I pushed the putty into place with a moistened toothpick and adapted it to the figure's shape with a silicone brush. I am not the greatest putty god and these gaps were pretty wide, so the result wasn't the best, but I hoped it would be good enough to not jump into the eyes directly when the figure would be painted. So, because of my missing putty skills, I had to do a bit more sanding to at least smoothen out the areas as good as possible. Because the uniform was designed pretty blank and empty, I wanted to add some detail in the form of photo-etched awards and ranks. So I glued an Iron Cross First Class and the pilot's badge to the chest, and the shoulder straps of an Oberleutnant or First Lieutenant onto the shoulders. And with these good looking upgrades the figure was built and I could concentrate on the base. Like I said, the basic base was built out of styrofoam, and to get a strong hold for the USB socket, I glued a massive piece of wood to the thin birch wood I wanted to use for framing the scene. So I cut out one side of the foam where the socket will be installed and made sure the piece will sit properly. Next I marked the position of the socket in the frame, drilled out the hole and, after testing the fit, glued the socket in place with a good amount of hot glue so it's not moving ever again when plugging in or removing the power cord over the next years. Now I glued the frame in place using wood glue. I fixed the frame in place with pins so it's not moving until the glue is dry, and this thin wood tends to bend when it's wet because of the glue. This too was avoided with the pins. And to make extra sure nothing is moving until the glue dried out, I placed rubbers around the frame, what also helps to press the corners tight to the styrofoam. When the glue dried out, I removed the rubbers and pins, cut off the protruding parts of the frame and filled the pinholes with Bergswerk spatula, sanding everything smooth with sanding sponges when the spatula dried hard. To guide the wire through the ground into the base, I inserted a piece of plastic tube so I will have enough space to get the wires to the socket safe and comfortable. Now I could create the terrain or ground of the base, and I here used Modeler's World Magic Earth in combination with the fixer solution fluid. I applied the Magic Earth in 2 layers to fill the base to the upper edge of the frame, so I didn't end up with one too thick layer that needs more time to dry. So, after applying the first layer and spreading it out with a soft brush, I soaked the Magic Earth with the fixing solution fluid and let it dry to the touch, what happened pretty fast. I then applied the second layer on top of the first one, trying to create a realistic looking desert-like surface. I put another plastic tube into the one which guides the wire through the base, so I didn't fill it up accidentally with the Magic Earth. With some spare legs I printed additionally, I marked the figure's position and added footprints into the loose Magic Earth. Sprinkled some cat litter over it as bigger stones, and fixed everything in place with another round of solution fluid. With the figure and base both built, I could then unite them, and after carefully guiding the wire through the plastic tube, I made holes into the rock hard ground with my tweezers, and now I could easily stick the pins in the figure's feet into the ground. When I was satisfied with the position and stand, I glued the figure in place with superglue. Of course, I had to connect the figure's wire to the USB socket, so I applied some soldering fluid onto the connection points and soldered the matching wires together. I am for sure no electrician professional, but this was easy enough that even I could do it. And to make sure the wires aren't moving anymore or dangling out from the underside, I fixed them in place with hot glue. I love it when a plan comes together. My idea was to hide the wires in a smoke trace the signal flare made when leaving the signal pistol. So, after painting the wires and the supporting copper wire black, I glued cotton with hot glue around the wires. I made some tries with super glue on a test piece, but that was too messy as the cotton soaked up the super glue like a sponge. And as a result, the cotton was sticking to everything it wasn't supposed to, including my fingers. So, hot glue was a good choice as it was thicker, but dried super fast too. The downside was that it created bigger blobs inside of the smoke trace, so I had to hide this under a thicker layer of cotton than I originally planned. I then removed excess hot glue blobs and hot glue strings with pliers and scissors and tried to shape the cotton into a somehow realistic looking smoke trace. With the smoke trace done, I neared the painting stage with huge steps, but first I cleaned the figure with Modeler's World Degreaser. This stuff removes dust, dirt and grease from my fingers, and it can be sprayed by airbrush or applied by brush for additional mechanical cleaning. As I wasn't sure how the cotton and the base would react to this sharp stuff, I decided to apply it by brush this time. And to help the paint adhere better to the smooth PE parts, I brushed a good amount of Tamiya's metal primer over them. And with that I was finally ready for paint. Primer time. I usually prefer lacquer-based primers for resin figures because they spray well and have a better grit to the smooth resin surface. But again, I wasn't sure how the cotton and the base would react to this kind of primer, so I chose for an acrylic one this time. I masked off the LED with tape and then started to spray the primer in thin layers to not flood the details and build up the opacity slowly. Although I used an acrylic primer diluted with acrylic thinner, it sprayed pretty well thanks to my Gallery Barbatos Rex with a 0.7 nozzle equipped. Even with this big nozzle, the airbrush is very precise and used less paint than I expected it would with a 0.7 nozzle. And as I had the black primer in the spray gun already, I sprayed the wooden frame with it as a foundation for the later brush finish. It went super fast with the big nozzle, and as I like these trigger style airbrushes for larger jobs, it was very comfortable and fun compared to a traditional airbrush. Of course, I had to mask off the USB socket before this step. I decided to do a pre-shading to work out the figure's details and emphasize its contours. For this I switched to my Mobius, which is a bit more precise with its 0.2 nozzle, and sprayed the light paint from above in a flat angle. This highlights all areas that would be hit by light shining from above. And this will also help me in the later brush painting stage to know where to place the shadows and highlights. And as you can see, I covered the ground with paper to protect it from overspray, as I liked the natural color of the magic earth and wanted to use it later for finishing the groundwork. I also wanted to spray the smoke trace to avoid the plastic-like look of the cotton and integrate it optically to the painted figure. So I started with spraying the cotton with the deck tan from the pre-shading and then lighten it up with white in 2 steps, finishing with spraying pure white on top. In the end, I wasn't sure if this was my best idea, as the smoke trace now somehow looked like a pipe cleaner brush to me. But I wanted to paint the figure first and decide afterwards if I had to replace the cotton for some unpainted one or if the overall picture would be matching. And that's the result of the pre-shaded figure. Let's grab some brushes now. I wanted to start with the skin tones, but I first had to paint the pistol because I didn't want to use this dark paint around the finished fingers and hand. So, base painting the pistol with a very dark grey was my first step. Next I added some light chipping and wear and tear with a bright metallic paint. And with super strong diluted black ink I then blended the chipping into the surface, knocking down the strong metallic shine. And with that I could move on to start the skin tones. My first step was to paint the eyes white, as I could make easy corrections with the base paint in the next step if I was too messy here. The base paint was applied in several thin layers, so I didn't cover the facial details and the pre-shading still had a chance to shine through. This is only the second face I ever painted in 1/16 scale, so I am not super experienced here, as I am more comfortable with 1/35 scale. So painting the face was a bit of try around and find out, and I will somehow try to wrap it up in a sequence that makes some sense at all. After base painting I made a wash with a dark reddish brown to bring the whole skin area into the darker shadow level. My plan was to start from here and work my way to the lighter areas by using lighter and lighter paints. So, with the first lighter paint, I painted all areas that would receive at least some light, leaving only the darkest areas like under the chin or under the nose untouched. The paint was diluted so it's not too thick and covering and blends better into the darker shadow paint. I will speed up the video time here and there to show as much as possible without ending up with a 2-hour video. With the next lighter paint, I painted the more raised and to light exposed areas. So it was all about the old game: the lighter the paint became, the smaller the painted areas were. I applied the paint by stippling from time to time, so the transitions looked a bit more irregular and less hard. Next lighter paint, next light level added. Again the area where the paint was applied became smaller, and like always the paint was diluted to not be too opaque. Now I started with blending shadows and highlights together. To knock down the strong contrast between the darkest and brightest paint, I used a lighter paint mix and applied this very strong diluted with retarder over the whole skin area. I used a soft dry brush to blend the layer into the surface by stippling. And I repeated this process until I was satisfied with the result and the look of the face. From this point on, the process of refining started. This is basically a matter of switching back and forth of adding shadow and highlight paints into the specific areas to work out the contours of the face as well as the lighter and darker areas. So I switched between shadows and highlights as often as I felt it necessary, adding shadows, then highlights and shadows again. Here maybe my lacking experience from painting 1/16 faces was a factor, because in this scale you can't just imply things, you have to paint them. With a bit more experience, I maybe could have taken a shortcut here with less steps of switching. But you have to start somewhere, and I hopefully learn for the next 1/16th project. When I reached a point where I thought it might be time to move on, I made a super thin glaze over the whole skin area with a magenta paint. This was supposed to add some lifelike colors to the dead looking highlights and some rosiness to the shadows. The paint was applied super diluted and blended into the face with a soft dry brush. Next I applied super thin red paint, glaze-like into the shadows and the areas with higher blood flow, like the cheeks and the nose area. This was supposed to bring more life into the skin tones, giving them more rosiness. I then unified shadows and highlights with a super thin glaze with the base paint. After the glaze with the base paint, I painted the highest highlights with the brightest paints to emphasize the most to light exposed areas. As you can see, painting faces sometimes is just a matter of patience. I knew I had to stay with it until I reached the point where everything came together. And this is usually very late in the face painting process, as the first maybe 80% always looks strange. I then decided to paint the eyes to get a better feeling for the overall picture and where I was standing. This time I decided against my usual method of using oil paints to paint the iris, but used acrylic paints because of the bigger sized eyes compared to 1/35 scale. My goal was to achieve a slightly upwards view, and of course this was not that easy. And I had to make corrections here and there until I was somehow satisfied with the result. After base painting the head and hair, it wasn't looking too bad at all, and I finished the face with painting the bearded shadow. I applied a dark bluish grey into the lower face area in several thin applications, and repeated this process until I was satisfied with the look. And as the really last step for the face, I added a super thin yellow glaze on the upper face area, like the forehead, back of the nose and upper cheeks, to give the impression of sun-kissed skin. After this long skin tone chapter, let's quickly summarize how I painted the hair. Over a dark brown base paint, I applied a warm brown tone, diluted with retarder in equal parts, so it's not covering the base paint completely. An even lighter brown tone was then painted into the upper area, leaving the more shadowed areas darker. Single strains were painted irregularly into the deeper areas. Into the lighter area, I painted an even lighter tone, strain-like, and again irregularly into the lower areas. This mix was lightened up several times, and again the lighter the paint became, the smaller the painted areas were. The highest highlight was just stippled into place, like a light ring onto the most raised areas. To unify all these light paints, I made glazes with the 3 browns I used in the beginning. The lightest one was applied into the upper area and the darkest into the lower and darker one. With the hair done, I could start the leather jacket, and after base painting it with a dark brown paint, I highlighted seams and outlined details like buttons and pockets with a very dark paint. I like to do this step in this early stage because I could make corrections, if necessary, very easy with the following lighter paints. Next, pretty similar to the hair, I applied a warm brown tone, heavily diluted with retarder, over almost the whole jacket. I here could make corrections where seams or outlines didn't come out perfect, but in general I tried to avoid painting over them. And this paint wasn't applied into the darkest areas, so they would stay darker. The warm brown tone was then lightened up with an orangish brown, and this lighter mix was applied into the more raised and therefore lighter areas. I wanted to try to imitate the irregular texture leather has, but I was too lazy to stipple it into the jacket's surface with a small, tiny brush. So, with a bigger dry brusher, I stippled an even lighter mix of the orangish brown paint onto the surface. The brush wasn't as dry as it would be when doing a dry brushing, and the effect built up pretty quick. To finish the jacket, I made a glaze with a warm brown tone to unify the stipple texture with the jacket and also give it some depth. I made sure the glaze wasn't pooling in folds or seams and to apply it in an even coat. The pants. I usually paint uniform parts like the pants by starting with a medium paint, then adding the shadows and highlight paints. Here I wanted to try it the way I did it on the jacket, starting with the darkest color, working my way up to the lightest. So I base painted the pants with a thin layer of the shadow paint. After that I again outlined details and repainted seams before adding the highlights. Now I added the first lighter paint, and this still pretty dark mix was applied into all areas that would receive at least some light. So basically everywhere except the deepest folds and crevices. What's also different this time is that I am not using retarder as a thinning medium. I saw in Calvin Tan's newest arcane painting guides that he uses matte varnish for thinning the paints. So, as he is one of my role models when it comes to figure painting, I of course had to give it a try. And I was really amazed how good it worked. The paint is looking pretty strong when it's still wet, but it dries out super fast, but without leaving tight marks or visible brush strokes. So, this is a great solution for smooth transitions without much blending, and I could increase the working speed because it dried so much faster than retarder diluted paint. So I used ultra matte varnish for the remaining painting on the pans as a thinning medium. And it has so much potential that I will use matte varnish a lot in future painting projects to get more used to it and see what's possible. I then added the next lighter mix into the lighter areas that would be more raised and exposed to light. Again, the paint was diluted with matte varnish, and when the strong looking wet paint dried, the result was pretty smooth. In general, these pans weren't the easiest to paint, as they were pretty smooth without much folds and crevices. So I had to emphasize what was there and tried to pick out these surface details with paints. You can always vary the opacity of the paint by changing the thinner paint ratio, and I here already started to use this paint mix heavily diluted to a glaze-like consistency to blend shadows and highlights together, knocking down the strong contrast a bit. Here too, the matte varnish worked really good as a thinning medium. The third highlight paint was added onto all of the most exposed or raised areas. Areas that should be lighter because they were raised the most, or because I wanted to emphasize and highlight them, like the tips of folds or the edges of pocket lids. The paint was diluted slightly stronger, so it's not too opaque and integrates better into the surface. Then I had to blend and integrate the highlights into the surface, and for that used the first highlight paint again, diluted to a glaze-like consistency, and applied it over the whole surface and made sure it wasn't pooling in the folds and crevices. Again, the paint varnish mix worked super well here. The last step on the pans was to paint the zippers with metallic paint and then make a wash over them with heavily diluted dark paint to give them some depth and knock down the metallic shine. With the figure basically done, I could finish the ground, and I started with applying a dark enamel earth tone over the whole ground. I also slapped this stuff randomly over the boots to integrate them optically to the ground. In the beginning I said I wanted to preserve the natural look of the magic earth, but at this point I felt it could be better matching to the figure when painted. And of course, after a few minutes of drying time, I had to blend the enamels on the boots with a thinner moistened brush. Next I used a very light enamel paint and applied this in a wetter dry brushing over the surface, so the upper details of the ground became lighter. And with the deeper spots staying darker, the whole ground gained more depth. I emphasized the footprints I created earlier with the darker earth enamel to make them stand out more. And of course the dust enamels were also applied and blended onto the boots. I then picked out single stones I made from cat litter earlier and painted them in matching colors. This always brings a lot more texture to the overall look of the groundwork. I then finished them with a dusty wash and a light grey dry brushing to work out the edges and contours. Now it was time for the last finishing touches, and I added some graphite with a pencil to the metal parts to make them look more metallic and realistic. And finished the base with a thick layer of Tamiya black for a nice finish. And that's it for today. I hope you liked my little excursion into the 1/16 scale in combination with some electricity. Although the electric part was pretty small, it was the first time for me, and it was great fun, and I learned a lot. I am not sure if or how often I will use LEDs or other electric stuff in future projects, but at least I now know more about this and know that it's not impossible to do for me. The figure painting was also a bit different because it was a bit trickier than I expected it to be in the larger scale. The skin tones came out okay after I had to try around here. The uniform parts were more routine, but also slightly different compared to 1/35. All in all, I am happy with the result and I like this little scene a lot. I built and painted this figure for the November group build of the German-speaking scale modeling podcast Abenteuer Modellbau I am co-hosting. And if you are curious now, the link is in the description. If you made it until here, thank you very much for watching. If you like what you saw, I would be very happy if you support me by subscribing, and I am curious to read your feedback and thoughts to this project. Und nein, das gibt es nicht auch auf Deutsch. So, enough said for today. Thanks again for watching. Good luck for your own figure painting projects. Stay safe and until the next time.